Ted Shackelford of Dallas and Knots Landing fame, Simone Bendix, Jerry Anderson, creator, writer, producer, all-around genius behind such shows as UFO and Space 1999. He gives us in 1994, Space Precinct. If you subscribe to my channel, first of all, thank you very much for doing so. Secondly, then you know probably that I already did a video review of Space Precinct. The reason I'm doing it again is because, well, I didn't like the way the first one turned out. I mean, it wasn't that I reviewed it before I put it up, but I had looked up some information on various websites about the production history because I was curious. And when I went back later, I think I quoted too much of that just off the top of my head. Too much of it sounded like an article. Space Precinct began, for me, in the 1980s with the unaired pilot of Space Police. I say that because while I don't still have it and can't pin down the issue, I remember Starlog magazine doing an article about Space Police, and I was fascinated by the concept and unable to find it. And then later, looking it up, the production story says that it didn't actually air. So I'm not sure how it made it into Starlog, or if it aired somewhere overseas, or they got an advance copy somehow in order to give it a review. I don't know. But therefore, I had seen it in Starlog magazine. I was a science fiction nerd then and an avid reader of the magazine. I learned a lot about franchises that I was not directly familiar with, except through the magazine. And it kind of always hung there in the back of my mind. So when Space Precinct showed up as something that I might be interested in on Crackle, the free service, I was like, is that related to? I had to look it up, and then I had to watch it. Ted Shackelford played Gary Ewing in Dallas and then Knots Landing. Other actors had played Gary when we first saw him, but Ted Shackelford played him the longest and did an amazing job. I mean, there's quite a few people related to that show, and I loved Dallas. That was something we all watched as a family growing up. But like Ken Kercheval, who played Cliff Barnes, it sort of became this typecast thing where he was so good in it, that's what you knew him from. Ted Shackelford did a lot of other stuff too, but you would always think of me. I always thought of Gary Ewing. He's a good actor, solid actor. When I saw this on Crackle, I thought that this would be interesting to watch. Jerry Anderson, a name obviously I'm familiar with from Starlog magazine from way back, but it's only been the last few years that I tracked down episodes of UFO, which I don't remember ever seeing as a kid. I vaguely remember there was a Space 1999. I was very little at the time that it aired, and it wasn't something, I don't remember catching it in like reruns. When I was growing up, you had the constant rerunning of Star Trek, which I loved. Obviously, I watched Star Trek over and over again. We also had The Hulk was on, and they had reruns of that, and Wonder Woman, and there was all sorts of fun stuff, but the Jerry Anderson stuff was a little harder to come by. I wasn't really familiar with it until I was older, and I finally, in the last few years, watched UFO and Space 1999, which that one uniquely kind of bridges the gap in science fiction. If you compare the ambiance of it, the uniforms and everything, to Star Trek, the motion picture, you kind of see the sci-fi thing of the 70s to the late 70s, leading into the 80s, and how it is developing as an aesthetic. But anyway, so Space Precinct was recommended to me. I thought it would be interesting to watch, and I can, immediately identify there are issues. There's been a couple times that I thought I was going to stop watching it throughout the one season that existed, and then I keep going back to it, and I keep finishing. I'm almost done. I'm like 2/3 of the way through season 1 now, and the difficulty it has is universe building, which is sort of a problem, and I talk about this in other of my videos. Building a universe that's able to be consistent and going forward from it and giving you a good, interesting place setting. We really just get thrust into Space Precinct. We learn that he was 20 years on NYPD, which actually means given that it takes place in 2040. He just started with NYPD in 2020. About 2020, he started in the NYPD, Detective Brogan. Anyway, it jumps right into the story. He's a police deputy, a police officer at this precinct on this planet where there's a mixture of aliens and humans with no backstory as to any sort of explanation of who all these entities are, why we're there, why it's as soon as 2040, even coming out in the 90s, even if you said it as early as 50 years in the future, we have a police station orbiting another planet, not our solar system, our star system, clearly, orbiting another star, and all these different types of species of aliens. Even if all those aliens knew each other and this whole assortment was already going on in this blended culture on this planet, and we suddenly met them and were allowed to go immigrate there, it sure is awfully sudden to be that familiar with the alien species, the technologies, and it still doesn't answer the riddle of why they wear police uniforms, which are passably, I mean, they're a little bit futuristic, but you immediately know that it's a police officer by seeing it. It's sort of like The Fifth Element when Bruce Willis and Lilu are being chased by a flying police car that is those colors and has the flashing lights. I mean, duh, it doesn't matter what century it's in. You know what that is, but at least that was set on Earth. Space Precinct being around this planet with all these aliens and humans are clearly, how they apparently are the minority. I'd say we don't see as many humans as we do aliens overall, although our protagonists are probably a little bit more, higher percentage of humans are protagonists. We have plenty of alien protagonists, but in the background, it's like a very extraterrestrial blended culture. It looks like, it reminded me of the comic book Legion of Superheroes being set in the 31st century, and they just randomly put whatever looking creature in the background when I was a kid because it's the far future, and there's how many species and how many of them are we going to meet and know and blend in with. But the year 2040, orbiting this planet, flying around in recognizable police cars, hoppers as they're called, flying around in uniforms that are, and the procedures with the court and the arrest, it feels like a very artificially imposed setting there. Instead of learning how they do law enforcement, learning how we're there. Like if you were going to do a modern reboot, well, first don't, because they all stink these days. But if we were going to do a new reboot of Space Precinct, it would be further in the future, further away, and with more science fiction type in-depth universe building of how these police act, behave, what their legal system is, instead of it just being like Law and Order superimposed or Hill Street Blues superimposed over the alien setting. Now, with all the aliens and masks and makeup and a lot of the puppets, the special effects of the time, which I never have felt like special effects make or break anything. I thought it was done fine, but it does feel a little bit Muppety, Jim Henson-y, and it does feel like maybe it's more of a kid's show, but then there's nothing about any of the plots that make it seem like a kid's show. It's relatively serious stuff dealing with illegal immigration, oddly enough, illegal aliens, crime syndicates, assassination of witnesses. We do get some science fiction things that are more typical science fiction, like there's a time travel episode, which is actually kind of really neat, that ends up back at the end where it began, the case. Alien invasions being done in a subtle way, and you've got to stop them and uncover the plot. So there's a little bit of that very science fiction stuff, but a lot of the stories are bad neighborhoods, drugs, young kids getting into trouble in the streets, your sort of typical crime show, except that it's orbiting an alien planet and on an alien planet only 50 years in the future with no explanation given. And I think that's really that's why we get a season of it and it doesn't really last. It's a great concept that just doesn't quite work. With the right people redoing it, if there were a good reboot, which I think Battlestar Galactica is the only one that I ever liked that was a reboot, But if you could get a good reboot version of it and fix some of those problems, the concept is actually very fascinating and very well done. The aliens that we get are very cool. They're very innovative. Their interaction with humans, that's all very neat. And I think it had a lot of potential that did not get fully explored, but it had those problems of feeling kind of lighthearted, but then it's not written lighthearted, feeling like it should be a little bit more Muppety, and it's not, feeling like it's not quite hard sci-fi. Then there's a time-traveling cyborg, alien, hybrid, human, like a Terminator thing. It's a great episode. But you don't know what to do with it, and I think maybe networks didn't know what to do with it. What I had read in an article about it was that, particularly in the United States, in syndication, they weren't sure what to do with it. It would end up being on late at night or early in the morning because it had that weird, more commonly, apparently the British were more accepting of this model, but Americans looked at it and were like, well, that's for kids. And then they watched it and were like, well, that's not for kids. But adults ain't gonna watch it because it looks like it's for kids. And so it just didn't quite get the audience that it needed to get, which, for that matter, UFO did not. I thought that was a fabulous series, but it just didn't grab enough of the public imagination to last very long. Ends up becoming Space 1999, which was meant to be a sequel. But Jerry Anderson, in my view, is a genius. I'd put him right up there with Gene Roddenberry, and I'm a Star Trek fan, as a guy who was a concept guy. But the concepts that he came up with play out differently depending on the supports around him. Gene Roddenberry was really a visionary, but we got to hand it to other people also that contributed to all of that. And I feel like Jerry Anderson was an idea guy and had these great concepts, but he didn't ever get like a Star Trek or a Star Wars. His franchises never became that. But I think they all had the potential to, if there'd been some more tweaking, if it had been worked out a little bit better. It's the concept is there and it's solid, but the product that we got was like it wasn't not quite ready for consumption. But it is absolutely enjoyable. It's entertaining. That's why I keep watching it. There's a few moments here and there where you're like, oh my gosh, that's kind of dumb, or that's corny, or that feels really corny in this setting. But then, I'm eating breakfast, flipping through my streaming stuff, and I'm like, yeah, I'm going to watch it. I'm going to start another episode. It is entertaining enough that it does that. And I've said before, you can find them free on Crackle. That is not a paid advertisement. They don't pay me nothing, but I've been enjoying Crackle, so I like to share the love. They've got a lot of different stuff on there, some newer, a lot of retro, all the way back to the 70s, the Partridge Family, etc. But there's a few commercials, but it's all free on Crackle, and you can find Space Precinct there. Go watch it, love it. Let me know what you think.